The government is not well suited to know what is happening in the local context, and a bureaucrat may just assign a child to certain services, which is not necessarily good. And if you talk about the larger public good, it should be based on data. And if anything, the family is well suited to take care of itself. And I would say the community, the relatives, and the religious organization or the civic organizations in the locality, they are best suited to support the families, and not somebody sitting thousands of miles away in an office who is a bureaucrat.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks. I'm very excited today to welcome my guest, Professor Dany Shakeel. He's a professor and director of the E.G. West Center for Education Policy at the University of Buckingham in the UK, and he mainly works on quantitative research on K-12 education in the United States, education policy. But he also studies social sciences more broadly. Thank you for joining me today, Dany.
Oh, my pleasure, Jim. Thank you for hosting me.
So, Dany, before we jump into this important study that you did with Brian Ray, the title of the study that's published in the Journal of School Choice, Demographics are Predictive of Child Abuse and Neglect, but Homeschool versus Conventional School is a Non-Issue. Evidence from a nationally representative survey. And we'll be jumping into that study as we go. But tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, well, I was born in India, and then I was a physicist initially. I changed my background from physics to social sciences. I went to Arkansas for a PhD in education policy because I wanted to change the world around me and understand the role of education in doing so. My mom was a public school teacher, and most of my family is into teaching. So I got the motivation from there. And after Arkansas, I went to Harvard to work there with Professor Paul Peterson. And I study school choice. I study topics such as the role of family, role of religion, and the role of government in education, and so forth.
So you were born in India and you went to university in America. Where do you live now?
So now I work in the UK. It's a place called Buckingham, close to Oxford and Milton Keynes. After Harvard, I was appointed as a professor and director of the E.G. West Center at this university. So I've been here since 3 years. And I work with Professor James Tooley, who is a specialist on low-cost private education across the globe.
Oh, interesting. So how did you meet Brian Ray? So Dr. Brian Ray is a longtime friend of mine, maybe 30 years, and I know he and his family well. And he has done a number of school or a number of studies that have been published in the Journal of School Choice and other places as well. How did you get together with Brian?
So I started going to a conference called the International School Choice and Reform Conference. It happens every alternate year in Florida, and every other year it happens internationally. So I met Brian and Betsy, who is his wife, at this conference, and we had a good chat. And I had no exposure to the phenomenon of homeschooling. I was totally new, and I was struck by this concept. Although we hear about homeschooling from our mothers, we never realize we are homeschooled. We hear about it in religion. We hear about this in books and in all of history. But somehow the term homeschooling is never used. So I was struck with the talk they had with me, and I took interest in understanding it further and contributing to it. So it took me a while before we collaborated again, but my journey with Brian Ray began in that conference.
And how did you guys decide to do this particular study, the kind of quantitative analysis? I guess is your study, is it considered quantitative analysis?
Yes, it's quantitative. So before this study, Brian and I did another study on the barriers to homeschooling. So Brian had collected some data on a survey that he had designed. Um, like he designed some questions and he wanted to understand what are the barriers to home education. So he was looking for a collaborator. And Albert Chang, who happens to be my colleague and is now employed in Arkansas as well, he reconnected us again. So Brian and I collaborated on that project, and from there, it was clear to both of us that our goals go further than that. So Brian again asked me that he wants this topic to be studied, and I was aware because while I was at Harvard, there was a controversy from the Harvard Law School where a professor who worked there said that homeschooling is essentially child abuse and it should be outrightly banned. So I said to Brian that where is the data that she has? And when I asked the question, to my surprise, those claims were not based on data. Now, because I'm trained in data, I said to Brian, let's design a research which can empirically test this claim and settle the question in terms of data, whether the claims are actually true or whether they are based on perceptions.
So I'm going to interrupt just momentarily because, I'm going to be unashamedly self-referential here because you guys actually quoted me in your study, which is interesting to me whenever I stumble across a quote of my own stuff. So this was sort of the infamous law review article by Professor Bartlett at Harvard that was publicized by Harvard Magazine in April of 2020, right before the world shut down due to COVID-19, in which she called for a ban of homeschooling because, as you say, she said it's largely or it spawns or it causes or it's a hotbed of child abuse, as well as other things. And in your study, you quote me as saying, given Bartholet's druthers, based not on empirical evidence, but on what is at bottom a competing worldview, homeschooling as we know it today would be outlawed. And that's the premise, that's the presupposition that you wanted to challenge?
Yes, exactly. That was the primary research question, and I'm thankful to you to highlight your role in it. And a second question that emerged from that discussion was that let's say abuse is happening in homeschools more than conventional schools. Like let's say it happens. So does it come from home or does it come from social settings such as community or schools? So that was a second part of the question which we wanted to test.
So when you set out to do this quantitative study, how did you approach it, you and Brian?
Now, the biggest challenge for us was that this kind of data is not collected by the government or any agency so that we can have a nationally representative sample. And we need a sample that is nationally representative because if it's collected from a certain group which is not representative, the findings will not be generalizable. And we cannot claim that this is actually a phenomenon that is represented across the nation. So that's the first thing that came to our mind. The second thing that came to our mind was that how do you define those kinds of abuse? Like what is abuse actually? So definition is the second component. The third component is that what if people are uncomfortable telling about these experiences because it's something personal, it's something traumatizing. So how do we ask about those things? So those three things came up to us when we were trying to design the research. And then how about designing a survey to address all of these problems which we discussed? So I can go into more details if you want to ask further, but this is the basic thing that came to us.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you started with the problem of kind of unsupported assertions, and those unsupported assertions got a lot of attention and have been amplified by the news media since then. And so I think it's interesting to hear more details about how you tried to control, to get actual data as opposed to unsupported assertions. So, as I understand it, you chose a population of adults who had either been homeschooled or maybe not homeschooled or some of both, institutional schooling and homeschooling, and prepared a survey. How did you go about identifying people and developing your survey?
So these are like two different questions. So what the first is development and second is like administration. So regarding development, Brian Ray had a great role. He went to all the government sources in each state and also the federal government, and collected the definitions they had in different domains, such as uh, let's say they were being abused through let me read it out, sexually or physically or emotionally and psychologically, or whether they were being neglected, abandoned, or they were also lacking any sort of family or social support. So those like six big domains comprised our definitions. And after reviewing all the government documents, we came up with 37 questions through which we can measure any abuse that the government has ever measured at different levels. So this is something that is like officially collected in the various formats. So we based our definition of abuse on the literature. The second component was to see if what we are measuring is different than what others have measured. So Brian and I read the literature, and our questions were fairly correlated with what others have done in other contexts. So it was something not unlike what others have done. So it was based on the existing data and existing work. Having said that, the second issue in front of us was to validate these questions. So we gave these questions to a small group of people who we selected through network search, and we tested the instrument, and it seemed to work well in terms of like statistical tests and other things. So the survey was good to go. Now, regarding the second component, which is how to select a firm and how to administer the survey, here we had experience with a survey firm called I'm forgetting the name. Sorry, Barna, yeah, Barna Group, and it has a national level sample which is representative. So we went for that, but we did not stop there. We also went for a snowball sampling to address various issues in data, and we constructed the survey weights. Now, our findings do not get affected by this particular methodology, whether we restrict our results to the survey firm or to the sampling method, which is snowball sampling. They are irrespectively held in both domains.
So, Dany, let me ask you a kind of more general question. When people are studying any number of social science kind of questions that involve people and their perceptions and whatnot, is this kind of the general way that you would approach something like that?
So public opinion was initially neglected, but now more and more surveys are showing that when you ask people questions in a certain way, it gives you the underlying truth of the society. Now, these opinion surveys are used for elections, for different kind of analysis, for understanding public demand, let's say for education or other things. Now, in our context, we did not ask them about the abuse happening today, because we're trying to understand what was going on when they were at the school age. So we asked adults who are more open to sharing their experiences, but these are being answered anonymously on internet. So we expect that they'll be honest enough on internet when nobody can see them and nobody can track them. And we asked them about what happened with them when they were growing up. So that is how we got to the desired truth.
And so, after you collected the data, what did you guys how did you process it, and what did you discover?
So we after collecting data, we cleaned it, and then we did analysis in a software called Stata, which is a statistical package. And there, the first step was to see the correlations between the different kind of abuse and the percent of school career, let's say from kindergarten to grade 12 at that age, spent in homeschool. How do those things correlate? Now, I must give credit to the opponents here, before rebutting them, that to our surprise, we found that in the correlation level there was little evidence that, oh, if you go to homeschool more as compared to zero homeschool, it seemed on the face of it that, oh, the abuse has some role to play there. So I can define it a little bit more. So it seemed that compared to somebody who did not go to homeschool at all, like 0%, if you compare them to someone who went to like homeschool 100%, which is from kindergarten to 12th grade, like all of it, then they were more likely to be abused by zero point 0.4 standard deviation. So it seemed that, oh, there's some truth to it, but as you'll see in the coming discussion, that it is not held in more rigorous analysis.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, and that gets into math. And there's a reason I became a lawyer. My eyes glaze over when you get into regression analysis and that sort of thing. So yes, please do explain that. What was the next step that assigning controls and things like that you guys did?
So the reason we assign controls is theoretical. So let's say if people are being abused more than others in a certain setting, abuse does not happen only because of setting. There are things that are associated with abuse. So if you read the literature, the literature says that abuse is more correlated with poverty, with family structure. I mean, the traditional family structure, the two-parent structure, seems to be protective of children as opposed to other formats. The parents who have access to resources, they are generally likely to invest in their child's safety as compared to those who are not. Similarly, foster care is a big predictor of child abuse. Now, those variables were totally unaddressed by Elizabeth Bartholet or anybody else. So we said that we should use controls for those variables to understand whether the school sector is actually a predictor by itself, or are those things the main factors which contribute to child abuse.
And those controls that you talked about have been widely studied and documented, yes?
Yes, exactly. So there are theoretical reasons to account for those factors. So we collected a bunch of demographic variables, ranging from what ethnicity they had, what gender they had, how their experiences were while they were growing up, their religiosity, their parents' uh, treatment with them, and so forth, their age, etc. Now, once we controlled for everything, the things that stood out to our surprise were four. And the first of them was family structure. The second was the years spent in foster care. The third was family size. And the fourth was the household level poverty. And in addition, the role of homeschooling was gone. Or I can say, in more broadly, the role of schooling was gone. So there was no association between whether you went to a particular school sector or whether you were educated at home, in comparison to these variables, which means that abuse is coming from social settings and not from home education.
And that conclusion, how strong do you feel your conclusion is from the data?
So there are two ways to look at it. The first way is to look at the coefficient itself, which becomes insignificant and its magnitude becomes almost zero, like negligible. So we can say that this has no role to play at all in abuse. The second is to look at a variable which explains the model. So if you look at the model without and with controls, once you add the controls, the explanatory power shoots up. So it does bring into question the theorists who counter home education without accounting for controls. So these two kinds of views on data help us understand that essentially it's coming from other variables and not from homeschooling.
So what's the next thing I should be asking you?
I mean, the second question was, if abuse is happening, where is it coming from? So fortunately, in our data set, we collected information on the source of abuse. So we had data of like two types. The one was who did the abuse incidents and where it happened. So I can give an example. So for example, if you consider a family, was it done by a parent or adult relative living in the home, or somebody who was like a guardian? And if it happened in a community, whether it was done by a neighbor or in a place of worship, or whether it happened in a park, let's say, or if it happened at a school, was it a teacher or a school staff, or was it happening during the school hours or outside of it? So all those things were available to us. Now, once we refined the data further and tested for the source of abuse, we found that if anything, the abuse is coming from social settings. It is coming from school and from community as compared to family. And if you compare the numbers, the statistics, the incidences of abuse are double at social settings as compared to at home. So which means that family is the protector of children as compared to anybody else. Now, this makes theoretical sense because any non-social actor who is not a part of family are likely to not care about the child. And on average, the parents are more close to their children. They have information of the context, and they're likely to invest in them. They're likely to protect them, and that's what we see in the data. So, if anything, it's the public policy that is being talked about for protecting children. It should be based on these variables, the ones outside of the home, and not the homeschooling itself.
And some of the factors inside the home are also pretty well known and studied. So like an adult male who is not related to the children living in the home, that sort of thing. How do you strengthen families in that sense?
Some people can claim that what about the few incidences that happen at home, and what do you do about them? Now, I'm trying to answer like more than what you asked for. So this question comes up, and it's problematic because what do you do with them? So some people might suggest in literature that, oh, just monitor everybody and take out the child of that setting. Now those things have consequences because the government is not well suited to know what is happening in the local context, and a bureaucrat may just assign a child to certain services, which is not necessarily good. And if you talk about the larger public good, it should be based on data. And if anything, the family is well suited to take care of itself. And I would say the community, the relatives, and the religious organization or the civic organizations in the locality, they are best suited to support the families, and not somebody sitting thousands of miles away in an office who is a bureaucrat.
You quote a friend of mine, Richard Wexler, for the proposition that removing children from the families and placing them into a foster care setting is often the worst thing you can do, even if there are issues within the family. Is that an accurate assessment from your view?
I mean, again, so the view should be based on averages, and we cannot like speak about everybody, because there might be instances where, let's say, a child is severely abused, and it's best to take him out from that setting. So those things exist. But if you want to talk about numbers and where the public policy should focus, I would say that on average it should focus on prioritizing those other variables and not the family itself.
So supporting the family to take care of the child better rather than removing the child and placing him in foster care is often a better policy goal.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the public policy should be guided by that view.
And I'm a lawyer, so the Supreme Court of the United States has said that there's a strong presumption that parents and caregivers have the best interests of the children at heart, and so we should not move too quickly to do something to kind of overcome that presumption. Is And I mean, it seems like that's also kind of backed by your research now.
Yes, I would say so.
Well, Dany, what else should I be asking you about this study, and what do you think that, so this is largely a homeschooling audience. What other things do you think a homeschooling audience should take away from this?
I mean, the first takeaway is that if somebody comes up with some kind of view, then ask them for the data they have, because claims can be made based on, let's say, one case. But at the same time, when it comes to policies, the policies require studying a large number of cases, and we cannot frame laws just based on a very bad case which happened with one person. We need to think about the consequences, both the intended consequence and also the unintended ones. And laws should be framed after considering data. And often the data says something else than what is being suggested. So that's the first thing I would say to homeschooling parents and proponents who are thinking about helping homeschooling families. The second thing is that there are other topics out there which should be studied. So child protection was one of them which we studied, and I mean, there are other things which I'm really interested in studying in the future. But as a researcher, my difficulty is to get data which is not easily available in most contexts.
So what is the next study you'd like to do if you could assemble the data that you need?
So, I mean, I have interest as of now in two things. The first is to understand the role of homeschooling in creating political tolerance, because that is something that is often associated with the typical public schools. And the claim out there is that the only way to create citizens is to send kids to district schools. That's the claim out there. So I have done some work on that question with private schools. I'm doing some work on that with charter schools, and I would like to also do work on that question for homeschools. So that is one study that I can do with survey work. I'm talking to Brian Ray if he's interested, or somebody else. So this is one thing I would like to study.
I believe Albert Cheng came up with some conclusions based on a study of homeschooled children, now adults, at a private Christian school. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I'm familiar with that. He used a data set that was already existing, so he was able to study that phenomenon there. Other data sets also exist where I think one can study homeschooling and those outcomes later on. But I'm interested in designing a survey and constructing definitions, because the definition of political tolerance has broadened, because we have more ways to measure intolerance as compared to the past. So this is something I would like to do through a survey and not through existing data.
And I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Albert Cheng concluded that the homeschool kids that he, from his data set, who were at private Christian schools, had a pretty broad political tolerance. Yes?
I think you're correct.
I'm not. There's a pretty good quote that I'm not going to be able to dredge up from my memory, but that's my recollection is his conclusion was fairly positive about political tolerance, which kind of runs against, the critics of homeschooling have a lot of stereotypes in mind that they, based on anecdotes, the media picks up. You mentioned, we shouldn't make policy decisions based on one anecdote or one bad case. And so a lot of this work that you're doing is sort of taking the stereotypes and figuring out if they're right or wrong. And I think that's really important work to figure out. When the data doesn't support the stereotype, that doesn't really make the front page of the Washington Post very often, but it's really important. So, well, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
I mean, not anything particular, but I really appreciate the work of HSLDA, and I really look forward to more interesting work from your organization, and hope to see you sometime soon in a conference.
Yeah, I look forward to meeting you in person as well. I'd like to attend the International Conference on School Choice at some date, probably the next time it's in Florida or sometime soon. Maybe we'll meet there. So thank you once again to Professor Dany Shakeel and for his study, Demographics Are Not Predictive of Child Abuse. It's really important work, and you can find that in the Journal of School Choice, and it is available without a subscription at that Journal of School Choice. You can read it for yourself if you're interested there. And once again, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this has been another episode of Homeschool Talks. If you'd like to support the work of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, go to hslda.org, and you can join, become a member, stand with us as we work to protect homeschool freedom, or you can become a donor and donate to our cause. So that's, again, hslda.org. Thanks once again, Dany.
Thanks, my pleasure.
Every week, HSLDA hears from hundreds of homeschool families, many of whom are facing hostility from school officials or discrimination from colleges and employers. We've helped single parents facing criminal charges for homeschooling their children, families traumatized by wrongful CPS investigations, and even a grandmother harassed by the state for homeschooling her granddaughter. By donating to HSLDA, you can help make homeschooling possible for families like these and enable our work to preserve freedom for future generations. Give today at hslda.org/donate. That's hslda.org/donate. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.